right, hello everyone. Welcome to our gender studies seminar, and thank you for joining us today for this very special session. My name is Tori, and I have the distinct privilege of being the moderator together with Yuxin. Today, we had the honor of welcoming our guest speaker, Professor Jack Halberstam, whom I will now introduce. Jack Halberstam is the professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. He's also the director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexualities, and David Finson Professor of Humanities. As an iconic figure in gender and queer theory, Professor Halberstam's work is characterized by its incisive analysis and groundbreaking insights. His scholarly contribution is extensive and defies disciplinary boundaries. In addition to numerous articles in academic journals and magazines, he has authored 7 books, many of which have become a classic in gender and sexuality studies. These include Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, Trans, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variance, as well as Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. Each of Professor Halberstam's books has introduced key concepts that have shaped the public discourse within the academic sphere and beyond. As one of the most influential public theorists nationally and internationally today, Professor Halberstam has written on topics in campus and cultural studies, the trigger warning debates, anarchy, and the gender and sexual politics with brilliant and provocative insights. We read his book, The Queer Art of Failure, in the last episode of season 3 of our seminar, and the work quickly became our favorite. Today, we had the privilege to have Professor Halberstam share his insights on queer politics, uses and misuses of queer art of failure, as well as the evolving landscape of trans identity in modern society. During the lecture, please feel free to post in chat window your questions related to Professor Halberstam's work and the topics discussed today. We'll select relevant questions based on the flow of the lecture and their scholarly relevance to Professor Halberstam's expertise. Without further ado, I invite you all to join me in offering a heartfelt welcome to Professor Halberstam. It is with the highest regard and sincere gratitude that I now cede the floor to Professor Halberstam, please.
Thank you, Tori. And thank you all for being here on a Saturday evening. I'm honored and pleased to have been invited, and I really want to thank Yuxin Yang for really, extending this lovely invitation to me and making it possible for me to be here. So what I'm going to do is I'll speak for maybe 40 minutes or so, and I'll just cover some ground, some of which you will be familiar with if you've read some of the work that I've put out in the last 10 years or so, and some of which will be new. And I'll share my screen so that you can have images for the things that I'm talking about. And then when I come back, it'd be great if people were to, start their video so that we can all see each other and have a discussion, because it's always so weird to talk into the void of these little boxes. Okay, so it's fine while I'm sharing my screen because that makes sense, but then after we'll see if we can come back together. So let me just start here, and let me see if I can make it play. There we go. Okay, so I think, looking back, if I was to try to describe what it is that I do and how my particular mode of thinking works, I would call it counterintuitive thinking, which is not the same as being contrary and just saying the opposite of what is commonly believed. Counterintuitive thinking sort of seeks out modes of engaging with identity or, ideas, cultural production, and so on, that seem not to have any value inherently. And by turning to them and finding the value within them, I tried to unearth some of what Michel Foucault has called subterranean knowledge, or disqualified knowledges, forms of knowledge that have often been cast as irrelevant or silly, as not worth bothering with, as ephemeral, temporary, not classical, not canonical. All of those kinds of knowledges interest me. I'm interested often in popular culture. My earliest work was on popular Gothic literature from the 19th century. Books like Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, places where there were all kinds of narratives about race and gender and sexuality lurking in these popular fictions that people who were studying literature had dismissed as being simplistic and superficial and not worthy of deep contemplation. So as you know, since in this group you read The Queer Art of Failure, failure is one of those counterintuitive modes of thinking. So I'm going to kind of begin with that, and then I'm going to move on. And I'm not exactly going to do this talk in terms of wildness and collapse, but only to say that Wildness, my last book, was similarly about a counterintuitive relationship to order. So we tend to think in, at least in capitalist societies, which at this point in time is most societies outside of maybe Cuba. Maybe there are economies in China that don't completely conform to capitalist modes. But failure in the context of capitalism has been cast in one way, and wildness has been cast in another. So failure has being cast as the inability to profit and to make money. Wildness, on the other hand, has been seen as part of a kind of anarchic order that is at odds with modern democracy and society. So in my last book, I tried to dig into the category of wildness and uncover some of the potentially anti-colonial ideas that were lurking in that category. And it was I really love that category, and I continue to think with it. The new work that I'm doing, however, has been very preoccupied with collapse. And I'll get into that in the second half of my talk. So let's just start with the concept of failing then. We'll just go through this piece by piece. And just to remind you, when I was talking about failure, I was really interested in the ways in which failure links together anti-capitalism on the one hand, and queer thought and queer modes of being on the other. Why does it do that? Well, because queerness is sort of, has been described within homophobic contexts as a failure to live up to societal expectations about what a woman should be, what a man should be, what a normative sexuality should look like. When we fail to live up to those normative standards, we often are cast into the category of queer. So queerness, in many ways, is the production of a very strong logic of failure. On the other hand, failure under the auspices of global capital is the word that we use for something like bankruptcy, the inability to make something profitable, the inability to make money from something. Now, the truth is there are lots and lots of practices that are not profitable, but that are deeply meaningful to people. You know, whether it's your hobby of gardening or playing the guitar or whatever it may be. We do all kinds of things that are not profitable. We also may exist within sharing communities where, without asking for something in return, we're willing to share things. We could share our internet, we could share our resources, we could share our food. So during COVID, in my neighborhood, people set up community fridges. And if you had extra food, you left it in the fridge. And people who didn't have enough food could go and get it from the fridge. And that was very much along the lines of this anarchist principle of mutual aid. So I think you can see that, like, success as a logic is already completely embedded in a capitalist cosmology. So by using the category of failure, I was able to create a theory within which anti-capitalism and anti-normative queerness reside alongside of each other. And that creates a very different, not very identitarian set of arguments about what it means to be queer. And I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of that now. So that's the first point about failing. The second point about failing is that success is a bit of a cover story, really, for a mode of capital that we should have seen coming. Now, remember, I wrote this book in 2011, and it came out right after the big financial collapse of 2008, 2009. And one of the things that came out of that collapse was the Occupy movement. And the Occupy movement had many different iterations in different parts of the world, but there was a sense in 2009 that the unfairness and corruption of the banking systems had been revealed, and that as these banking systems began to fail, that we could celebrate the failing spectacle of global capital and make something else happen out of this failure. And Occupy Wall Street was one of those great political movements that sought to do that. And what was great for me, anyway, about Occupy Wall Street was that it refused to perform resistance in a way that's already been mandated by capitalism. So capitalism demands that you perform your resistance in the street with a police escort at times that have been agreed upon between you and the local authorities, that you are peaceful, that you move quietly and slowly through the city, and that then at the end you disperse. And Occupy Wall Street, the whole point of occupation was to say, we're staying here, we will not move, and we will not make demands because you will then try to meet them. We will simply stand here in a rebuke to the system as a whole. And I thought that was very effective. And I remember giving one of the earliest talks I gave from the book, when the book had just came out, was at an Occupy Wall Street type of event. And I felt completely like the ideas in the book and the ideas in Occupy Wall Street were sort of in sync. So when those banks failed, however, we did not see the end of this extractive and accumulative mode of capitalism. Instead, and many people in the Occupy movements and the various anarchist movements were trying to say this was not the end of something, it was the beginning. It was the beginning of a more rapacious form of capital that was determined to kind of secrete wealth into the hands of the 1%. And indeed, here we are some 12 years later, and that is exactly what has happened. Some 10% of the world's population own some 90% of the world's wealth. At that point, by the way, this is not really capitalism, nor is this really democracy. So through this disastrous first financial collapse and then financial capitalization on collapse, we've ended up in a new form of disaster capital that is delivering around the world one right-wing government after the other. And it's these right-wing governments with their populist appeal who are producing new forms of homophobia and transphobia. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But that's an important piece of the story, both about failure, but also about what happens after failure and the way in which capitalism is able to transform failure into a new set of restrictions. And so all of these places, like with right-wing governments like Brazil, now Argentina, some, China, other places are very, very concerned about homosexual and transsexual communities and begin surveillance of those communities, precisely because within those communities are the seeds of the next mode of resistance. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So I decided in my book, when I was writing it, that, okay, we've got queerness, we've got anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, anti-racism. But the other thing about failure is that failure can be not just a either or, you succeed or you fail. Failure can be a style, a way of being. And you can see this in Quentin Crisp, who was a very famous Queer Around Town in the 1930s and 40s, right after the Great Depression, when Wall Street collapsed in 1929, Quentin Crisp, rather than saying, okay, we all have to save money and become successful, Quentin Crisp instead said, if at first you don't succeed, failure may be your style, and never sought to own anything, to have money. He instead sought to be a fantastic persona, and failure therefore became a way of life. And I think there's something very queer about that, and I really celebrate that in the book. The other mark of failure is the way in which certain kinds of subjects are not admitted into the market. So capitalism, especially neoliberal capitalism, is often seen as capable of absorbing any kind of resistance into its fabric and then reproducing it the next day as something that you can buy, and there are very notable exceptions to that market ubiquity. And in my book, I make a big deal about the fact that capitalism seems unable to be able to commodify the butch lesbian. So here are two examples, and I really feel like that was an important part of that book. And it's not necessarily the thing that people take up so much, but for me, it remains true that the butch lesbian who does not appeal to heterosexual men, unlike the femme lesbian or the gay man, the butch lesbian who has no desire for heterosexual men is also unable to become a conduit for capitalism or the commodity form. And so if you look at someone like Martina Navratilova, at the height of her career, when she was the best women's tennis player in the world, she could not get a sponsorship, right? So she was number one in the world, in the early 2000s, whenever it was. And there was a blonde player from Russia who had all the sponsorships. She had the Nike sponsorship. She had, a big fashion sponsorship. She had a perfume sponsorship. Martina never had that kind of backing. She had two sponsorships in her career: Subaru, which is a car company that is driven by a lot of lesbians, who knows why, and Rainbow Visa, which was a credit card that was trying to capitalize on the new visibility of pink capital. And she was a spokesperson for the Rainbow Visa. No one I know I've never known anyone who has used a Rainbow Visa card. So it was clearly not a lucrative sponsorship. The other one is Caster Semenya, who was a South African runner, and who, flaunted her musculature and strength. And as punishment for that, her record in the 800 meters was doubted, and she was investigated for whether she had too much testosterone in her body, and therefore whether she should be prevented from competing. So I'm just using these examples to show and to say that the place where capital fails to commoditize is also a place to look for very robust forms of resistance. So the fact that the butch lesbian cannot be absorbed into the marketplace says something. And I still think about that, and I still think that that's an important piece of this book. Okay, I'll do these last two pieces quickly. I tried to show what the archive of failure might look like. And I told the story of an Australian Aboriginal artist, Tracy Moffat, a photographer, who in 2000 was asked by Australia to be the official photographer of the 2000 Olympic Games to be held in Sydney. She was an Indigenous woman. This seemed like a very good look for Australia at that time, who had a horrible record for supporting its Indigenous communities. Tracy Moffat proposed for the Sydney Olympic Games to do a photo project called Fourth. And of course, what Fourth meant were pictures of all the people who came in, not second, not third, but fourth, meaning outside of the medals, outside of recorded history. And fourth, of course, refers to the fourth world of Indigenous peoples. This was, to me, such a brilliant project, precisely because anyone who's ever played sports knows that sports is not about winning. Most of the time when you play sports, you lose. Most of the time, unless you're like Rafael Nadal or something, most of the time you lose. And on the back end of your career, most of the time you will lose. So losing is a much bigger part of the drama of competition than winning. One person wins, everybody else loses. Everybody else loses. To me, this was just an absolutely gorgeous project. The Sydney Olympic Games rejected it, and it was never shown as part of the official games. And that tells you how little tolerance our societies have for the spectacle of failure, losing, and so on. We continue to believe in winning as the only option. Okay, of course, the other kind of compelling thing about my failure narrative had to do with animation. And really, that was what brought me to the topic of failure in the first place. I was absolutely consumed by Pixar films, and with a few exceptions, like the Aardman animations of Chicken Run and others. I really, really thought something special was happening at Pixar. And I realized that failure is actually a very common experience for children. Children are okay with failure, but they are taught that failure is not acceptable. And therefore, the films that they kind of vibe with are films in which failure is not something catastrophic, but is simply part of the fabric of life. And so Finding Nemo was just a really great example of this, because, you know, Dory, this Ellen DeGeneres voiced queer fish, is a complete failure in the film in so many different ways. She doesn't remember anything. She gets lost all the time. She can't lead the way to anything. And yet, at the end, she's able to lead this incredible rebellion of the fish against the fishermen. So there are a couple of things I noticed about animated films for kids. One is that they addressed kids as a collective group. And because they needed to address them as a collectivity, because kids are not a couple, they're not part of a couple form, and they're usually not individualized radically. They tend to be part of groups. And so we get a lot of collective themes of resistance and revolution in children's films. And I made a big deal in the book about that. There's Finding Nemo with the rebellion against the fishermen. And then, of course, there was Chicken Run and the wonderful spectacle of the revolutionary subject known as Babs. And Babs was the seemingly foolish and naive knitting chicken who, when Ginger, the organic chicken intellectual, as I always love to say, who, you know, is saying we're going to die free or die trying, right? And the chickens have been penned in by the farmers, and they realize that they're going to become commodities and they have to get out. Ginger says we're going to die free or die trying. And Babs says, are those the only options? That's very much in keeping with the logic of the failure book. There are more options than failing and succeeding, and we should be paying attention to those other alternatives. Okay, so moving right along, that's just to sort of summarize what you in many ways already know, because in your group you read that book. I just thought I would say something about trans politics. I think it was in about 2016 or so, a friend asked me to write a short book on trans politics that would explain really to potentially non-trans people what trans was all about and why we were all suddenly hearing about trans politics all over the place. So I wrote a quick book that tried to say that trans was not a bounded identity. It should not be simply a word used to divide these people from those people. And I used the little asterisk, that star next to trans, which is used in internet searches to say, look for this term and others like it. That's what the star means. It's a diacritical mark that means other things like this as well. And in that sense, I wanted to tell a different story about trans than the ones that I was seeing in trans studies, in which trans concerned people who had took hormones and had surgeries and had always known that they were trans and were on one kind of trajectory and then arrived at their destination. In many ways, my trans journey is about remaining in transit. And I actually have a little tattoo on my arm that says in transit, and it's a little banner sitting on top of a ship. And that's kind of my feeling about trans, is that, you know, gender is a process, not simply a way of being. And I'm not saying that people just change and alter at will. I certainly don't. But the fantasy of transgender as a journey where you start at one point as a woman and you end at another point as a man, or vice versa, I wanted to say this is absolutely not right. More than that, however, I wanted to say that trans politics had to do with more than just looking for recognition and inclusion, and are actually about investigating how trans disrupts the entire binary system of gender altogether. And so even in that book, I began at the very end of the book in another reading of an animated film, the animated film, The Lego Movie. I start talking about, in the Lego Movie, it's a fabulous film, you should watch it. The whole wonder of Lego Town or Legoville, whatever they call it, is that the town can be built and unbuilt all the time, because Legos, their property is that you can build them up and you can take them down and build something else. And in that film, there's a villain who's called Lord Business, right? He's the capitalist. So we continue this tradition of animated films with a very, very anti-capitalist orientation. And Lord Business decides that he wants a fixed town because it will be easier to govern. And so he comes along with a weapon, which is super glue, and he tries to stick the Legos in place. But the heroes, who are these very genderqueer characters, have an alternative to the super glue, which is a little piece that you put on top of the super glue. They call it a pièce de résistance, and it stops the super glue and leaves Legoville in flux. And that's how I wanted to open up the opportunities for thinking about trans as a kind of architecture in flux. And that in many ways led to the next project, which has been about what I call building on the work of a 70s artist, Gordon Matta Clark, an architecture in which the main vocabulary is about breaking things down. Okay, so this is part 2, and then there's one more part after this. So I just want to explain to you this this new work then that's on architecture, that in a very unlikely way came out of thinking about Lego Movie. And in 2016, I went to see a show. When I first got to New York for my new job here, I went to see a show in the Bronx by a Chilean-American artist called Gordon Matta Clark, who in the 1970s, for a very brief period of time, from 1970 to 1977, when he died at the age of 35 of cancer, he pioneered this incredible practice called an architecture. Now, an architecture was from its very beginning a critique of real estate politics. And this is one of his projects. It's called Fake Estates, as opposed to real estate. So it's playing on that idea of real estate. And in this project, he went around and he bought up what's called gutter property in the city. And it's all these little bits of property that nobody owns. And he bought them with the stipulation that no one could ever build on them and no one could ever make them into something of value. And he bought like, I think some 25 plots. And it's a lovely way of thinking about how to leach value from the system, these small interruptions to the daily business of capital. He talked about his work, however, as a kind of linguistic project. He said, what I do to building is what some people do with language and others do with groups of people. I organize them in order to explain and defend the need for change. This is a lovely kind of transy statement, thinking about the need for change. And as I did in the Queer Art of Failure, connected that change to anti-capitalist revolt, here we might see it as connected to a kind of anti-architectural mode of thinking about the city. So if the grand schemes of the 1970s in many modernist cities around the world, from Brasilia in Brazil to New York City to Paris, the main idea of modernist architecture was to create easily managed and governed systems within the city. And so if you think about someone like Le Corbusier, he was the modernist architectural thinker most identified with that idea, that what you do is you confine people into very efficient apartments that are all the same, and you make it easy to control and manage a very diverse and multiplicitous population. So Matt Clark, against that entire regime of thinking, he said, how about we stop building things and we start unbuilding? And so unbuilding has become the key word of my new project. And he coined this new word, an-architecture, which links, of course, architecture to anarchy. And it's a reminder that architecture is a very dense transfer site for capitalist value. Most cities around the world right now are in the grips of real estate speculation. And foreign investors buy up property in Vancouver, Toronto, in New York City, in London, in Paris, all over the place, in Rio, right? In order to hide their money from taxes and other forms of attrition. So Matt Clark, in the very early stages of real estate capital, realized that this was what was going on and exhorted people to see what was happening with real estate and to make a stand against the transformation of living space into commodity. Okay. And a lot of his work is trying to show that the spaces that we live in, I mean, look around you, it's mostly empty. That's what you're paying for. You're paying for an emptiness. You're paying for vacancy. You're paying for this space that you live in. A space, yes, that is bounded by walls and a roof, but what you're living in is this empty space for which you have often paid an exorbitant amount of money. So against the modernist project of Le Corbusier, who said architecture can solve all kinds of urban and social problems. And remember, Le Corbusier was, in the early years of World War II, an explicit fascist, because he liked the way that fascist governments were controlling populations, and often doing it through architecture and through a very orderly vision of the urban environment. Think of Leni Riefenstahl's films, think about the fascist architectures of Berlin in the 40s, Madrid in the 40s, right? Matt Clark, against all of that, said, an architecture seeks to solve no problem. And that phrase is kind of echoes in some of the slogans and protest mantras of the Occupy movement some 50 years later. The other thing that Matt Clark said that can be easily misinterpreted was nothing works. Now, it is true that in the 1970s in New York, nothing worked. Things were falling down. The city was bankrupt. There were rolling blackouts. The city was a demolition site. But that's not what he meant when he said nothing works. What he meant by nothing works is nothing is a practice, and making nothing is a work. And so his works were literally nothing, because if you take a building apart, as he often did, what are you left with? Nothing. And the nothing is the work. Okay, so it's a kind of negative ethos to this work that really appeals to me. And you can see that if you read the Failure book, that I'm quite interested in these negative capabilities of these counterintuitive modalities. So here's a piece of his, just to give you an example, in case you're like, well, why do we care about this dude? This was called Splitting, and this was a house that was already set to be foreclosed upon and demolished. And he asked for permission to split it in two. And what he did is he took a massive chainsaw down the middle of the building. And then at the same time, he dug out the foundation in the back of the building so that when he split the building in half, it would splay open like that. Okay, so he's sort of playing on the idea that the building is like a body, and that connection between buildings and bodies is an old one, goes back to people like Louise Bourgeois, the artist, the feminist French artist who made all kinds of drawings of the woman as a kind of architecture. The woman's body is a dwelling place for another being, for parts of her life. So the female body is often seen as a form, as a building. And by splitting it down the middle, in a way, what Matt Clark was doing is saying the body can be changed. It can be cut into, it can be split, it can be surgically altered. And so some people have actually read his cuts as akin to gender reassignment surgery, so sex reassignment surgery. And so the things that people do to their bodies to make them livable when they're trans, top surgery for trans men, bottom surgeries for trans women, for example, these kinds of surgical cuts were very much the vocabulary with which Matt Clark worked. And so I became very interested in this vocabulary to push back on the idea that trans is a becoming, where you become a man or you become a woman. And instead, I use this vocabulary to say, no, trans is an unbecoming and an unmaking of the scene of gendering altogether. And here's another one from Paris in 1975. He also used his spectacular cuts into abandoned buildings to comment on gentrification. And this was a building that he cut into just as the Centre Pompidou was being built in Paris in 1975, in order to call attention to the way in which the neighborhood was being reimagined to make way for all of these new buildings. This is very significant right now because here we are in 2024, and Paris is being prepared for the 2024 Olympic Games. And massive parts of Paris, mostly where poorer people reside, are being cut and altered, cleared, and demolished to make way for athlete villages and performance studios and fields. And those people are simply being displaced and removed. So it's a good time to return to this work and think about the commentary on gentrification that echoes across the decades from the 1970s, saying to us, beware of these gentrifying projects. I mean, that's how I read the work anyway, as a kind of caution, a warning, a marker of a kind of impending collapse. Okay, so let me connect this then. Now people might be like, okay, 1970s, whatever, how does that play out in the present? So let me explain that. So as you can hear in this unfolding narrative, I'm trying to say that trans is an unmaking of the body. And here I think I'm thinking along the lines that Butler works with in Undoing Gender, which is one of their less celebrated books, Undoing Gender. But I think Butler's on the same path in that book, with refusing to give us a rendering of transness as the remaking of the gendered body, and instead thinking about it as an undoing and an unmaking. Now, because I'm interested in architecture and urban environments, there's a word for that in urban architecture, and that word is destitution, where something is undone, unmade, and sometimes rendered unprofitable completely. So what would it mean to destitute trans? That's the question that I'm going to pursue for the last part of the talk. I'll try to finish up in the next 10 minutes, okay? So in a really beautiful essay on this category of destitution, two theorists, Kieran Ahrens and Idris Robinson, suggest that destitution means to tear down, dismantle, and cancel prevailing political representations and institutions without proposing others to replace them. So the instinct when we want to take something down is to say, and then we'll put this in its place. But what if we don't? What if we just pause? We take something down, and then we pause to see now what is possible. If you already have decided what's going in its place, then you haven't lived with the absence of having taken the thing down. And that's really a part of what I've been calling an architecture. So this is what this looks like in a contemporary piece by a transgender artist. So in 2020, I think it was, a very famous theater in Massachusetts that has been connected to Jacob's Pillow, which is a beautiful dance theater. This theater, the Doris Duke Theater, burnt down 2019 in Massachusetts. And this was seen by everybody as a kind of tragedy. Not by trans artist Eve Laris Cohen. Eve Laris Cohen rushed to the scene and began pulling stuff out of the wreckage with which he constructed a new piece of work. One of the ways in which Gordon Matta Clark described what he did was, he said, and you'll hear resonance in this phrase from other things that I've said so far, he says that an architecture means working with absence and opening spaces to redistribute mass and emphasizing internal structures through extraction. That's the exact method that Eve Laris Cohen used. He comes to this wreckage. He worked with the absence of the theater. He opened the spaces to the redistribution of mass, and he pulled the internal structures of the theater out and used them as a foundation for a new performance piece. And this is what it looked like. So this piece, which was called, I think, Conservation Restitution, something like that, you can see that what he did was pull the innards, the pipes, the girders, the wiring out of the theater, reminding us that any piece of architecture is not only the external structure, but the internal, pieces, the things that make that theater work. At the same time, Laris Cohen was going through some health problems, and it turned out he had a digestive system disorder called Crohn's disease. And you can see that therefore working with these innards is a kind of meditation on his own internal turmoil. And here he is, having set up this new grid from the wreckage of the theater, he would raise and lower the grid up and down, using a crank wheel that was very exhausting for him to turn until his body gave out. So it's a really beautiful piece, very much in the spirit of trans unbecoming and trans and architecture. People investigated the fire, couldn't figure out what its causes were. And when Laris Cohen was asked about both the cause of the fire and the cause of his own embodiment, this is what he had to say. He said it comes, I can't read that because, let me see if I can see it here. Yeah, he says it comes from, he says he's not interested in the cause of the fire. And that comes from both a trans and a crypt sensibility, from my desire to resist or refuse others' desires to know, whether it be gendered anatomical details or the cause of my chronic illness, which incidentally could also be classified as undetermined. This is not a situation where the artist builds something new. This is not a situation where the artist is building something new out of the ashes of the old. Instead, what he's doing is making a kind of an architectural spectacle of this theater that has collapsed, has been completely ruined by the fire, and now is reimagined in this artist's studio as an example of trans unbecoming. So there's a very recent example of somebody using the language and vocabulary, the lexicon of an architecture to represent trans unbecoming, not only in relationship to the alteration of the body's gender morphology, but even in terms of what's happening internally in the body. Okay, and I just want to end this section by saying that, you know, contemporary politics, as I said at the beginning, around trans issues are all about visibility. And I think that that's a mistake. You know, there's this do you see me kind of recognition politics is not quite the way to go. The right wing are deeply concerned with trans politics, partly because trans, non-binary, and queer people, young people, are not confined to liberal and left-wing homes, right? There's so many young queer and trans people today, and non-binary kids, and many of them are in right-wing contexts. They are in the families of the people who are authoring this transphobic legislation. So what I'm trying to say is we should not be asking for recognition from these corrupt governments. We should be engaging in this kind of dereliction of the political order that deems us to be the problem that has to be eradicated. We should be trying to destroy this political system, not asked to be recognized by it. So on that topic, ambiguity has become, you know, very much the key word of the moment. And I'll just say a little bit about ambiguity and then conclude, okay? I don't want to go into this in great detail. In fact, I will skip my various quotes, but just to say that ambiguity is in many ways a kind of cultural constant across younger populations. A non-binary in English is the term that many young people are using to describe themselves. And while some people, and I was going to give you this long quote by a theorist called Kaji Amin, what he's basically saying is that people who call themselves non-binary are just like consumers who believe that they can just pick an identity and put it on them and decide day after day who they are. But that's not quite right. Non-binary young people are basically, I would say, saying no to the generation that came before them, no to the debt that they've been asked to inherit, no to binary gender, no to environmental decline, no to global capitalism. So instead of focusing on the binary, we should be looking at the no. And Levi Horde, who's a young PhD student at Columbia, where I teach, has said that non-binary demonstrates a resignification away from pre-existing binary determinations without repeating its restrictions, doing damage to the assumption that one must be a certain type of subject to refuse a restricting ideology, to hold a resistant politics, or to participate in a coalition. And I really like this statement. I think this is a much better conjuring of ambiguity and of the kinds of politics we should be interested in to oppose these new right-wing phobic movements. And some people like artist Wu Sang has called this in-betweenness and are interested in sort of investigating the spaces between. So let me just conclude with a few images that I think are much better than the usual images that we get of trans people. And I love these images, don't get me wrong. That's Claude Cahun in the top right from the 1930s, Della Grace from the left from the 1990s, and Kathy Opie's portrait of Hans Schürl, bottom right from the 1990s. Most trans and queer photography in the 90s was of figures, individuals, individualized bodies. I think we have to get away from that in order to invest again in a kind of collective, solidarity-oriented sense of what trans is all about. And on behalf of that, we should be looking for abstract representations. This image is also by Della Grace Volcano from a project that he did in the Arctic. And it's a very disorienting image in which you don't know if you're looking at the clouds upside down, or is that the sun, or is that foam? And that disorientation is also a good representation of queerness or transness. This piece by, I think his name is Johan Gruner, is a Dutch trans artist who makes string art. So what you're seeing in this piece is a gorgeous rendition of what cannot be seen, and a reminder that it's Jonah Grunboer. And the art critic David Getze asked of this work, what does it mean for an artist to make works that are hard to see? And there again, there's a pushback on the seemingly intuitive logic of visibility. What if we weren't so invested in visibility? What if we were not wanting to make ourselves available to the commodity market to be seized upon, but instead we're interested in not exactly invisibility, but illegibility, let's say, an illegibility that opposes the modalities that capitalism demands that you use to present yourself as right or good or successful. Finally, this is a Black non-binary artist, Kian Williams, and he makes, and this returns now to my architecture work and the notion of collapse. He makes this beautiful hanging sculpture. The bricks are from demolished low-income housing buildings. And as I say here, it represents both an impulse to save and an impulse to refuse rescue. Ultimately, he's a non-binary artist representing a figure that is also a kind of abstract rendering of the body, and that is in suspension, object and subject. And for me, these are more interesting, more wily, crafty, cunning responses to capitalism than holding up a sign saying, I'm here, please see me. So I want to offer these tales of detransition, of these tales of trans-destitution, non-representational art, by way of opening up a conversation here about failure and beyond. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Halberstam.
Yeah.
For your so thought-provoking and insightful speech. I'm sure we all have learned a lot from this lecture, and now we will go into the Q&A session of our seminar, and we planned some questions for you, and then for about after 30 minutes, we'll open the floor up to address some of the audience questions. And at the same time, I noticed that there are only 2 questions so far from our audience. So we really encourage you to take this invaluable opportunity and raise any question you have and share your understandings. So without further ado, we will first read some of questions that we've prepared. So the first question we have is that, so you mentioned in the interview back in 2019 about the idea of queer world unmaking in relation to like the commitment to queer world making project among many of the queer theorists. So I found this idea really fascinating and provocative. I know you talked a lot about the idea of unbuilding in relation to architecture and gendered body in your lecture. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what this queer world unmaking or unbuilding involves in terms of community building and as a mobilization strategy.
Yeah, that's actually part of this project. You know, community is such a tricky word, isn't it? Because for some people it's very important to be in community, but community can have a kind of coercive value to it as well. And in order for community to really, you know, operate, it tends to demand a kind of homogeneity. And so I'm sort of interested in thinking about other forms of collectivity other than community. Community also in an English context tends to have almost a Christian implication, because it shares a root with the idea of communion and communing with God and Christ and all of those kinds of things. And so a lot of the ways in which community has been used, particularly in the 20th century, have been sort of disastrous. So instead, that's one thing. The other category in your question, Tori, is world. World is another one of these coercive categories, and it's mostly used in a very colonial way to suggest we are the world. And the we are usually Western, white, European, and American actors and subjects who understand that their way of thinking, their way of being, and their way of doing is worldly, and that their obligation, therefore, is to spread that knowledge around the world. And so the world becomes an extension of Europe and then an extension of the US. So world is itself a deeply coercive project, and it's been debated in many different philosophical contexts. Heidegger is probably one of the philosophical references, and we know that obviously Heidegger had fascist sympathies, but he in his best philosophy, he was trying to take apart categories like world and think about how being in the world means something very different for a rock than it means for an animal, than it means for a human, and so on. So world unmaking is a philosophical project as well as a political project, in which we think about what it would mean not to think in terms of that kind of universalizing orientation to everywhere, as if what happens here needs to just be multiplied across everywhere else. And where Euro-Americans see difference, they tend to see inferiority, lack, undeveloped nations, and so on. So I think both world and community can come apart. Now, the unmaking part of that, Tori, is almost a question mark. We don't know what would happen if we stopped thinking in those terms. So remember that idea that destitution is taking things apart without knowing what would then come to replace the thing that you took apart. Similarly, my project is to sort of collapse the idea of community and world without knowing what comes after. Knowing only that if we remove these very authoritative molds for thought, that other ideas and other ways of thinking will emerge. And so that's kind of the idea behind a book that I wrote the introduction to, and I'm very fond of, The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Hani. At one point, they say, we shouldn't be projecting into the future about what comes next, because when you do that, you extend the present into the future. What you need to do is allow for this disastrous present to come undone. And only in the wreckage of this awful reality that we've created is it possible that we might see something else. So that's world unmaking.
Thank you so much for your answer and elaboration. That's just so inspiring to me, and I love how you took those words apart and talk about the colonial heritage, for example. Yeah, and our next question is about the more of like the overall intellectual trajectory of your scholarship. So we were wondering, can you elaborate on the intellectual development of your scholarly and theoretical pursuits, beginning with your earlier study on female masculinity and progressing through the puerile failure and wilderness, and also culminating in your present emphasis on trans studies. What has been some of the paths of this evolution, for example, and we were just curious about the kind of the intellectual underpinning that drives your this whole pursuit. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. It's pretty much what I said at the beginning, that I often take sort of counterintuitive paths through territory that some of which has been well worn. So even in my first book on monstrosity, you know, I wrote on behalf of the monster, you know, so rather than saying, oh yes, the scary vampire and the scary ghoul, the monster, the zombie, my point was that what we find in the monstrous figure is all of the categories that normative mainstream society is rejecting. Therefore, we are the monster, you know. So that was the first sort of iteration of that. And then with female masculinity, rather than write a history of lesbianism, my point was to not do an identity project, but to say, rather than investigating lesbianism across time and place, that would be just a kind of colonial and trans-historical projects. There are not lesbians everywhere. Lesbian is a profoundly Western word coming from ancient Greek and from societies who are invested in ancient Greek cultures. So the lesbian is a very, very poor category for investigation. So instead, I said, what would happen if we investigated masculinity in women across time and across space? And that yielded very different answers than what would happen if we looked at the category of lesbian over time. Because you can find versions of female masculinity in ancient cultures without it necessarily meaning what it means now. You can also find versions of female masculinity that are connected to radical politics, but also versions that are connected completely to fascist politics. And I give the example of various eugenicist writers who saw masculinity in women at the turn of the last century as being evidence of women who were superior to their inferior feminine counterparts. So there, you know, to me, I still think that that book, despite the fact that it is a little dated, that investigation was a good investigation. It was a good way to go to think about masculinity rather than lesbianism. And, you know, from there, those are the kinds of projects that I do. I tend to not pursue identitarian projects. The same with the next one. It was about time and space in a queer time and place. It was not about the emergent identity of trans people. It was, what do sexuality and transgenderism look like when they're in different contexts? What is rural transgender embodiment? What is urban transgender embodiment? And so on. And then the last books that I put out, the Queer Art of Failure, the trans book, Wildness, and now this book on the aesthetics of collapse and on architecture, they are unruly books, sort of undisciplined books that are trying to take words that have been rejected and find all the rejected thought that lies within those words. Like, if we see wildness as just a force that has to be kept at bay, we also are not paying attention to lots of unscripted forms of being, different forms of sexuality, different forms of indigenous riot, and so on. So I think that if there was any method to my madness, it's had to do with the counterintuitive.
Thank you so much. I have to say that as a very junior scholar, I found that trajectory to be really inspiring and driven by a really clear message. And the next question I have is also kind of relevant to your earlier work. So in your earlier talks and writings, you've discussed the idea of capitalist realism and emphasized the importance of acknowledging anarchy and wildness. So how do you currently view this concept, and what aspects of your understanding have evolved, and are there anything that also remained consistent throughout?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a bit of a critic really of capitalist realism, which is very much associated with people like Zizek, but also, what was his name? Mark Fisher, who wrote the book on capitalist realism, because I like the argument, which is that capitalism, in this kind of Althusserian way, capitalism doesn't just produce the means of production and then control them. It also produces a reality within which one thinks that this is the only way in which work and leisure, pleasure, and production could happen. That's what is meant by capitalist reality, is that these state apparatus put in play, through a culture industry, a version of reality that is uncontestable, and therefore it becomes increasingly difficult to challenge capitalism. And that has proven to be true. Let's face it. It's very, very difficult to find a vantage point from which you can not just critique capital, but lay out an alternative to it in the world that we now live in. And that's, really tragic to many people. But the problem with capitalist realism is that there's no way out of it. There's just, it's a closed circuit. If you listen to Zizek, and he's a Lacanian, which then doubles down on the force of capitalist realism, because Lacan also believes that we are stuck in this symbolic system. There's no way of changing it. It may change, but we won't change it. So for anyone who believes that there could be change or there should be change, then capitalist realism is a bit of a trap. So I acknowledge that capitalism produces its own realism, and that realism makes it very difficult for us to think in terms of alternatives. But I deny completely the idea that there are no alternatives. And this is where something like anarchism comes in, where you think about an economy that is not mobilized and managed by the state, and we believe that we could do things differently, and that this particular reality that we inhabit is not inevitable, and is not all that's possible.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this question and answer is also kind of related to the first question that our audience have, but I will leave that to slightly later. But before that, we also want to ask something about the more practical implications and some of your opinions. So for example, in your discussion, you've pointed out that the issue of people overly fixating on like labels while overlooking the underlying structures. And in light of this, what should our focus be effectively addressed on the divisive dynamics that hinder the formation of a queer coalition capable of challenging heteronormativity or even capitalism that you've been talking about, or like even the idea of the queer coalition? We were wondering what's your thoughts about
What coalition? Is that what you said?
Yeah, yes, queer coalition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the only person who's currently, sort of lost faith in an identity politics at this point. Most people believe that queerness has to be tethered to something else. I mean, after, gay marriage became a route for incorporating gay and lesbian communities into the democratic state, we had to become more creative about resistance, because it's highly likely and possible that the white gay man that you live next door to, is secretly voting for Trump because Trump will be better for his taxes. So under those conditions, yes, we do need queer coalition, but the coalition has to be with groups that are ostensibly fighting for very different things. So the coalition has to be with poor communities, homeless communities, Black Lives Matter. What we don't want is this idea that gays and lesbians are the most marginalized people in any given society, and that's the place from which rebellion will come from. That's just not true, at least in Europe and America. It's certainly true in other places where sexual minorities continue to be persecuted in various ways, but we maybe wouldn't use the terms gay and lesbian there. So given my commitment to respecting other vernaculars and vocabularies that people use in different parts of the world for the formations that in the US we call gay and lesbian, I just think there's a limit to the, the politics that can be carried out under that heading. And in fact, a lot of research that's gone on under the heading of gay and lesbian has been critiqued by people outside of the US and outside of Europe for being universalizing and homogenizing. So going along with that, what I'm seeing among young people is a deep, along with that category of ambiguity that I was talking about in my talk, where you have identified as ambiguous or non-binary, you clearly are not part of an identity politics, or at least you don't desire to be, because you have refused to name your identity. You saying you're non-binary, you're ambiguous, you're in between. Once you've given up on this kind of definitive declaration of self that used to be accompanied by this whole process of coming out, well, now you're up for a different kind of politics. You're saying, my politics will not be based upon who I am, but what I want to bring about, the change that I want to see. And that change is going to be connected to an abolitionist politics. It's going to be connected to an anarchist politics or whatever it is. So I think we're less in the moment of queer coalition and more in the moment of cross-class, cross-race, cross-political solidarities.
Thank you. That's very insightful. So we will ask the final question, and then we will cede the floor to the audience, because I see here there are already 6 questions, so we definitely want to have enough time to address those questions. But before that, our last question, a very general question, is that could you suggest some books or readings that will be particularly inspiring for activists in terms of guiding their directions and approaches in their activist work?
I mean, there's so many books out there. I do still really advise people to read The Undercommons. I think that's a great book. I think Lisa Lowe's book, Intimacy of 4 Continents, is a very brilliant attempt to think about slavery alongside coolie labor, alongside the institution of liberal thought in Europe. It's a very big study, and I think that we need those big studies nowadays. Saidiya Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, which is a study of Black rebellion from the beginning of the 20th century. What else? There's The Extractive Zone by Macarena Gomez Barris, about queer and indigenous groups in Latin America and the kinds of protests and resistance that they stage to global capitalism and spiritual capitalism and other forms of extraction. I would be looking for, work about the global South within your networks that doesn't come from the US and doesn't come from Europe, and is working with different scripts around capitalism, around change, and around the body. Those, I think that in the US, we should be trying to translate more work. We should be trying to learn a lot more from people who are living out their version of capitalism very differently, and who have imagined different kinds of activist responses to it. So I feel very done in a way with US queer theory at the moment. And I will say, I just read Mel Chen's new book, Toxicity or Toxic. I think that's a great book. Mel wrote a book about animacy in the past, animacies, queer animacies, and this new book is about toxicity, and it has really interesting work on Anglo-Chinese relations, and the kind of, British patronizing attitudes, but also lots of stuff about the Opium War, and quite cool queer theoretical conjuring of a anti imperial position, I would say.
Thank you so much for all the recommendations. So now we will turn to our audience question. So for this section, we want to give the audience the opportunity to unmute and ask their questions. I mean, if you can't do so, you can also let me know. I can read out the questions aloud. So first question is from Kira. Kira Ma, do you want to unmute?
Thank you, Dr. Halberstam, for giving us this inspiring lecture today. And I just want to ask first question is, what if you write the clear art of failure in nowadays, especially after the pandemic? And I do have another question. I don't know if we have like enough time or not.
Yeah, go ahead, Kira. Ask your other question.
So yes. So my second question is about actually my own research, because I did my master's thesis on queer people using tattoo as self-care method on TikTok. And I was using queer art as failure as one of my theoretic support there. And sorry, I'm a little bit nervous.
That's fine. I'm really enjoying speaking with you.
Yes. So while like I'm doing my research, there is a theme I created called actively create failure to against normativity. But after I like done my research, I'm thinking about one question. Since tattoo is already incorporated by our mainstream culture, especially when they are creating like TikTok trend about like don't be sad, get a tattoo, and the tattoo is serving as a technology to the neoliberalism, neoliberal like idea of self-care to get better mental health. Is that still an act of queer art or failure? And how do we think about when people use some method which was thinking about like rebellion or like deviance, but now is already being normalized to trying to against a certain system?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. That's the exact point, Kira, is that nothing remains resistant for long. I mean, this has proven to be one of the primary methods of neoliberal capital is incorporation and the swallowing up of resistance so that it gets transformed back into more of the same. So, you know, getting a tattoo, I have tattoos. I love tattooing too, but is it a resistant subculture? Not necessarily. Is it part of something that you're calling self-care? Yes, very likely. It's also part of this whole set of activities that we do to make our bodies habitable and meaningful to us. But the question about what would failure 2.0 look like? I mean, I think that book was written at the right time. You know, it was post the financial collapse of the markets in 2008. It came out just after that. And it shared in that sense of these capitalist practices are impossible to sustain. And at some point they will collapse. When that happens, are we ready to try to bring about some other reality? And the answer was no, we were not. That collapse, we found out, was engineered by the insurance companies who wanted the bank loans to not be paid back, who wanted the banks to fail, and who wanted to collect insurance on all of those failures. So once that whole set of transactions was revealed, there's not much hope left in failure, as it constitutes a big part now of the way in which capitalism sustains itself. So capitalism we can see now, is built to fail and to fail repeatedly. And when the banks fail, the governments bail them out and they begin again. extracting money and resources from people, hoping to fail again so that they can collect the insurance on that failure and begin again. So one thing I want to say, however, Kira, is that failure isn't a thing or an action or a one-time event. Failure and success are bound to each other in a logic. And the queer art of failure is to constantly watch the evolution of that logic and evolve with it so that your attachment to failure doesn't result in just a new form of capitalism, but continues to reside in a kind of resistant relationship to it. And that means not being attached to certain things emotionally that have been endowed with great value in capitalism, not perpetuating certain narratives about, everyone, never stop believing in yourself. All of those kinds of cliches of capitalist culture we have to divest from. So I still believe in failure as a logic, but I think you can even see in the current, in the current animated films that circulate, they are not at all radical in the ways that the ones that I wrote about were. I mean, Chicken Run, Robots Inc., Monsters Inc., Fantastic Mr. Fox, they were all hiding these very radical messages, but none of the films that we see nowadays are doing that same thing. It's almost as if once that was revealed, the studios went back to making the same old crap. So failure remains of interest to me, but I probably would write about it quite differently, given that it's so clearly a part of the way that capitalism perpetuates itself.
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Kieran. Thanks for sharing your research as well.
Thank you, Kira, and thank you, Professor Halberstam, for answering. So now we will proceed to our second question on the list, which is from June. June, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, because I located in mainland China, so for the safety and I cannot turn on the camera. Sorry, and I have Professor. As you mentioned about Semenya and other queer people, other women in sports and the competition, I just have a very specific question about the queer people in the sports field, because we know that the sports field is a quite unfair place with the structural gender asymmetry, and the sports competition is based on the binary division of gender, and the transgender intersex binary athletes, they need to experience the forcible examination on their gender in the name of fairness. But nowadays, the sports fields, they issued relatively inclusive policies for people who are not confined to the existing system of gender. I mean, like the transgender people, intersex people, and the non-binary people. But they also issued this policy on the basis of a strict testosterone test. So how do you view the implications of gender in ideology embodied in the policies and the governance of sports?
Yeah, hi June. Thank you for that question. This is what I want. I don't have a big answer to that, except to say, if sports wasn't connected to the potential for great commercial and monetary reward for people who are successful, we would be paying way less attention to the particular chromosomal gender of any particular athlete. So the recent fights about particularly trans women in women's sports are so engineered by that very binary of success and failure that I was talking about, precisely because for people who succeed in sports, and that's a very small, tiny elite of the athletic community, for people who succeed, there are commercial opportunities for them. And yet that's never mentioned as the reason. It's just like, oh, this trans woman who's benefited from testosterone in her earlier life is going to, you know, take away my chance for glory. Well, that's not really what it is. So if we simply supported athletes and paid athletes properly for practicing their craft, in the same way that if we paid artists properly, some of this competitive zeal would disappear. And then we wouldn't, I mean, what's really telling about the investigation into people's genders in the sports field is, like with Caster Semenya, they said, well, we're not sure that she's a woman. We're going to have to investigate. Okay. But you're so sure that she's not a woman that you're willing to put her through this whole battery of tests, suggesting that it's easy to tell whether someone's a woman or not. And yet it took them 1.5 years to decide that she was a woman. 1.5 years. I mean, that means that what it means to be a woman takes 1.5 years to discover, suggesting that it's actually way more complicated than any of these logics, the logic of either or suggests. So in that time that it took them to decide whether Caster Semenya was a woman, she had missed her best years for running, you know, and that's the real tragedy here. And similarly, for trans women who want to compete in women's sports, I just think we all need to get over that. People should be competing in the category that they feel most identified with. And people who are competing regularly as sort of top level athletes should be paid properly, so that we're not, you know, creating this dreadful adjacent competition between people who would otherwise not be critiquing each other. I think a lot of women would feel differently about performing alongside a trans woman if they knew that they're all going to be supported in their sports, you know? So again, a lot of this comes back to the way in which sports is being marketed for commodity returns, rather than who is and who is not male or female.
Thank you so much, Professor Halberstam. Now we will proceed to our third question, which is from Xinyan. Xinyan, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi, Professor Halberstam. And I feel like you sort of already answered my question, because I just wanted to ask about like sort of this trend of like non-binary gender being like widely recognized to a certain degree, and sort of becoming like the third category, and whether like in that sense it is still considered a site of resistance, or which would term the emptiness or the unbuilding, when it does become imbued with like a certain meaning, at least in people's minds. So I was wondering if you would say the same thing that what you just said about you know, how capitalism absorbs these categories really rapidly, and a site of resistance is easily shut down because of that. And if that's the case, then I also have another small question about how like visibility is something that like we see in academia a lot too, like the fact that, you know, the categories of like lesbian and like gay or like gender studies, these are frameworks that we nonetheless have to work within. Like, even though you don't necessarily like, you know, you question the meanings and also the constructions between those behind those categories, yet you still have to publish in those journals and you know, get it to the right audience. So sort of what are ways of thinking around that, I guess?
Those are great comments, Xinyan. Are you a professor or a student somewhere?
Yeah, I'm a student in anthropology at USC.
Oh, cool. Very nice. So I don't think non-binary is a resistant category, and I hear you implying that it's not either. I mean, you're saying it's kind of coming into being as a third category. I think it's probably a 15th category. It's just the one that took hold for young people. And the reason that I think it took hold for young people in this era is because for anyone who said that they didn't necessarily identify with normative manhood or womanhood, they were quickly being pushed into the category of trans, which didn't necessarily suit them either. And when that happened, you know, where we ended up with this like very hard binary, very strong binary between cis or normatively gendered and transgendered, a lot of people who were questioning and genderqueer were earlier versions of non-binary were like, I need another category. And I just think it's so significant, though, Xinyan, one of the things that I'm trying to say is that it's so significant that the category that emerged as the one that people wanted to occupy was a category identified as non-being. You know, this is what Kaji Amin got really mad about. And in that, I didn't really show you the quote, but his essay, "We Are All Non-Binary Now," is a rant against non-binary. And he calls it the most neoliberal and neo-colonial category of all, because people seem to just think that they can announce who they are and what they are, despite the fact that we know we live in a system where we're very constrained in our ability to identify ourselves. So I think he's missing the point. I think the point is that the category of non-binary is organized by a kind of disidentification, an attempt to say no to, it's like in that, you know, Queer Art of Failure, the Babs, are those the only options? Are the only options normatively gendered or transgendered? Or are there other ways of being in a gendered body? And I think non-binary is simply asking that question. Will it be absorbed into capitalist rhetoric? Yes, it already has. And it already describes so many different kinds of people that I no longer really know what it means. But at the same time, I'm happy to use it. You know, I think it has real use value. There was another part to your question, but now I can't remember it.
I was thinking about sort of the stubbornness of these categories within academia.
Oh, yeah. Well, academia moves slowly. You know, change happens radically elsewhere, but slowly in academia. I think actually in academia, I think what you were actually saying originally was about visibility. We still have to use these categories to publish and so on. And I think this is going to be related to the next question, which is about academic contexts and of privilege and failure and so on. And I hear you on that completely. We can't just ditch visibility because it's important to make contributions to scholarship from certain kinds of positions that are visibly registered and on behalf of certain political positions that can be identified and recognized. I'm simply saying that when we do politics, capital P, in these sort of mainstream contexts where we're opposing right-wing transphobia, we should not be resorting to recognition and visibility. We should, in fact, be way more cunning and stealthy. And we should be, you know, thinking in terms of the kind of diffusion, if you like, of non-binary, trans, and queer people into all kinds of households in the US. Instead, it should be a kind of act up narrative of we're already there. Not, hey, I'm here. Can you recognize me? I'm already there. I'm already in your house. I'm already beside you. I'm already living with you. And that's honestly what those right-wing bigots are most afraid of. They know that. They see their kids, and they know their kids are deeply compelled by these ambiguous categories and just waiting to adopt one. So yeah, so I'm looking for these larger categories of identification for the purposes of changing the mainstream narrative. But thank you for that, and good luck at USC.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Halberstam and Xiyan. So I think the next question, as you already mentioned, is kind of related. So I can read out the questions first because Ke-Yun told me that they can't unmute. So
Okay,
but
yep.
then Yeah, and you can decide whether or not to address it as a separate question or some addition to this questions in end test. So hi, Professor Halberstam. Thank you for the inspiring presentation. I was wondering about the potential tension between the politics of failure and the positions of privilege that many of us academics occupy. Since academia is not a haven from neoliberal capitalism, but rather an integral part of it. So you talked about the limitation of visibility politics as an attempt to seek recognition from the system and suggested that we should perhaps strive to dismantle the system altogether. And I wonder if the same can be applied to academic institutions as well. Can you share your thoughts on the institutionalization of gender and sexuality studies in the university and how we might situate ourselves in relation to it? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I'll make this quick so we can get to everybody. But Kyun, that is a fantastic way of asking that question, and embedded in it is already the answer, which is that academia is not exempt from this the neoliberal institutionalization of resistance. So when one minute something's resistant and the next minute it's part of the frame. And that happens in academia all the time. What should be happening in academia? We should be destituting universities in the sense of taking apart the disciplinary foundations of the university that restrict what we study, so that we are almost never studying, for example, economics alongside culture, or political science alongside radical philosophy, or philosophy alongside gender studies, or chemistry alongside, anthropology. These disciplines have held certain modes of thinking apart and made it very difficult for people to see the big picture. So all I can say to that question is, yes, as long as we're in the university, we should be trying to change it, because the university is a very moribund space. It's also a place for money laundering nowadays. It's a place where most of the Ivies are mostly interested in their endowments and preserving them. And sometimes the teaching and the scholarship comes second to that. So I in no way think that the university is exempt from any of the things that I'm describing. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Professor Halberstam and Ke Yun. So now we will turn to the Hao Pan for their question.
Hello, Professor Halberstam. So my question, so the first one still sort of concerns the pedagogical questions. So this one concerns a point that you mentioned in passing. I saw that someone else has also brought this up. In the beginning of the lecture on the intimate relations between queer failure and anti-normativity. So the latter terms reminds me of a special issue published by the journal Differences, published in 2015, on the implications and possible limits of anti-normativity as a kind of foundational term for queer theory and politics. While I am aware that you published a response piece in 2015 to this issue, arguing that queer theory without anti-normativity is straight thinking, I'm wondering whether the forms of ambiguity or illegibility that you mentioned in this lecture, okay, I lost it. Okay, could add to this debate by pointing to something away from anti-normativity understood in this sense as pure oppositionality and towards something more akin to what Marcus Bate terms as non-normativity, which for them refers to something like a subversion, a decline to state that refuses the logic that structures the ability to say yes or no. I understand that they're saying that non-normativity is operating on a different terrain as anti-normativity. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this distinction between non-normativity and anti-normativity, and also the relations between, so I didn't really add this to the question, but also the relations between queer theory and trans theory. I think this is also sort of a topic that has been of some discussion in TSQ, for example, about whether trans studies is sort of queer theory's evil twin, to use Stryker's phrase. And yeah, so, and what this kind of distinction or what both term could mean for queer or trans politics.
Again, Zhao, are you a student or a professor somewhere?
I'm a master's student at U Chicago.
Nice. Okay. Thank you for that question, which is really well informed and beautifully articulated. I appreciate it. Very clear. You know, the thing is that things change over time. So when I was writing Female Masculinity, for example, it was very important to think in terms of an anti-normativity, because it was impossible to do anything but basically say gays and lesbians are just like you. You know, that was the only route available, was to say, no, we can be normal as well. We're not all perverts. We're not all deviant. And female masculinity was a way of trying to hold on to the anti-normativity inherent to certain positions without imagining that that would not get absorbed eventually back into capitalism. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. As I said about Martina Navratilova, female masculinity remains an unassimilable way of being for capitalism, because nothing can be sold through a masculine woman. The masculine woman is an aberration as far as capitalism is concerned, because it's either addressing itself to straight, gendered, heterosexual women, or heterosexual men who have to desire you. The women have to identify you with, the men have to desire you. So my point is that some of the topics that I've chosen require anti-normativity. Now, as gay and lesbian community is more oriented towards a marriage politics, less oriented towards a transformative politics, we may well think with Marquis Spey about non-normativity. And that's a much better path than the differences issue that we're arguing against seeing anti-normativity as a foundational term. That's just was a stupid argument as far as I was concerned. I'm just like, why are we having this argument? Better to do something like what Marquis did, which is say, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to resist the logic as a whole and go with the non-normative. Brilliant. I'm with that. What I'm not with is just sort of saying no to anti-normativity as if you can say no to it depending on your subject position. A very femme man, a very butch woman cannot ignore anti-normativity and its force, because they experience it every single day, right? So now, to go to the last part of your question, I mean, I have a whole other talk, honestly, on this supposed tension between queer theory and trans theory. I think it's a complete distraction and waste of time. And the idea that trans theory is queer theory's evil twin, I'll tell you exactly how that works. If you follow that logic, which was stated by Susan Stryker and then repeated by Andrea Long Chu, what you end up with, Zahao, is a familial metaphor in which you have two siblings in the womb, one's eating the other. So you have a weak sibling, the trans, you have a strong sibling, the queer. The womb, Susan Stryker tells us, or Andrea Long Chu, whichever one, is feminism. Now they want to kill the mommy, but guess what? There's no daddy. No daddy anywhere to be seen. If there's no daddy, how are we critiquing capitalism? How are we critiquing the symbolic? How do we critique the colonial structure under which everything takes place? It's a bad theory. It's a bad metaphor. It's a bad organization of rhetoric, all of it. So that's my talk on that. And my answer to that is queer theory and trans theory have shared boundaries from the get-go. And it's ridiculous to act as if there's a trans theory and a queer theory and that they are not constantly entwined, entangled, and in conversation. So I don't think that antagonism buys us anything but more identity politics. It's bullshit.
Yeah, right. I just want to sort of respond to this before like everyone moves on. So I totally understand. I know you have beef with Andrea Long Chu, but I do like her work.
Just with that piece, just with that one piece.
Yeah, I know. After trans studies, right? Yeah, but I totally agree. But I still have sort of a a reservation on your point about butch women not being absorbed into the capitalist
Okay.
economy, because
Mhm.
I did my undergrad thesis on sort of a emergent trend of radical feminism in China online, where women are sort of advocating for the refusal to, for example, there's a demand to cut your hair short because there's an understanding that long hair reduces your efficiency to earn money. So I did my undergrad thesis on this. It's sort of super long, but not really that long, but 100 pages or so. But the thing is that I see that some of their demands in sort of advocating for a kind of fantasized version of masculinity understood in the forms of the things I talked about, like for example, efficiency and understanding makeup as sort of obstacle to women's self-empowerment. They sort of still buy the logic of capitalist self-help without being, so I'm just saying that refusal to be incorporated into a capitalist economy of desire or a capitalist economy of spectacle where there's no commodification does not mean that it cannot be capitalist. So
For sure.
I think that
For
is
sure.
sort of my reservation. It could just be operating on a different level or using different logics without relying on certain mechanisms.
Got it. I can hear that and agree with that. Quick thought to you is I hope you're going to go on to a PhD.
Yeah.
You know where you're going? Are you staying at Chicago or are you going elsewhere?
Yeah, I still sort of haven't finished my MA program because this is sort of 1 year. I'm still in the process of writing my MA thesis, which is sort of about necropolitics in China's trans communities.
Awesome.
And yeah, we can talk more if you want to.
Email me, no problem.
Sure.
Thank you for your engagement, though. Honestly, I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I still have 2 more questions, but we can move on to someone else if
you can email me and we'll be in touch. I'd love that.
Okay, sure. Wonderful.
Anyone can email me. My email is on the Columbia site, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Hao and Professor Halberstam. We will, I guess, get to our last question from, well, I guess last or second last question, but now we will turn to the end for their question.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, actually, I feel like my question already be answered. So Kaji is actually my advisor, but of course I don't need to agree with them. I don't. I was thinking about asking you, like, could you elaborate on the very inspiring point that the non-binary as expression of young generation's intention of, saying no, that refusal. But I think you've already talked about that a lot. And I also want to ask you about, the how that refusal is different from the so-called radical anti-normative potential that many believes in the concept of queer before. But I feel like you also, talked about that. So,
but Deanne, let me ask you. I mean, that I respect Kaji a lot. I think he's really smart, and that essay is very smart. I just really disagree with it. And I just want, and that honestly, that's part of being in academia. I mean, when someone writes something polemical, it's okay to disagree. And it sounds like you disagree too, because one of the things that Kaji's doing in that piece is he's saying non-binary people are operating under the assumption that they can at will just name themselves, and no one can do that. Well, we know that came from Butler. Butler told us that in 1991. We all read Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter. So young people, it's kind of saying young people are stupid. They think that they can do something that we know they can't. That's not what it is. That's all I'm trying to say is, like, Kaji, I feel you. I understand this. I can see that non-binary has become a weird, diffuse term that describes too many different things. But what if when people say non-binary, they mean something else? So that's what I'm trying to interpret the no in the non-binary in a much bigger context within which we recognize, we, meaning my generation, because this is a very generational split between non-binary and trans. I don't think that, you know, when some non-binary people are critiquing trans for being binaristic, I think that's a bit ridiculous. But I'm trying to recognize that if you were young at this moment, which I am decidedly not anymore, you would be very justified in feeling that the legacy that is being passed on to you of debt, environmental decay, of a crappy authoritarian political system, these media platforms that create immense amounts of wealth for a few people and extract all kinds of creativity from everyone else, right? You would be potentially extremely disappointed. And at that point, saying non-binary might articulate some little piece of that disappointment. And I'm very willing to believe that because, you know, as somebody who teaches in a university, I see how angry and you know, how angry young people are and how desirous they are of change. And so I think that when a term comes out of a different generation, we should pause before we slap it down. You know, non-binary won't last. It's not going to last. It's clearly, it's got all the marks of a fad and a phase and a trend. And as we know from all of our social media platforms, things that trend also fade. It will fade, and there'll be some other terms, and we should be open to all of them.
Yeah, I guess you two will both agree that naming will never be a solution. I think that's you both agree on.
Yeah.
What you disagree on is whether non-binary is an act of naming, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
I think
that's a
I
good
get
point.
that part. Yeah.
And Dan, what's your actual research on?
My research is about the it's about the queer women's activism in the Sinophone area, which so I still identify myself as a queer feminist activist. Also, I've been in the U.S. academia for over 7 years to finish my PhD. For me, what I see is, among those activists, connection and their collective action and all these things, like how their efforts is not necessarily bring any changes, but it bring changes to each other. Something I don't know.
That's nice. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. We shouldn't be looking for change simply in the macro. It happens in the micro as well. That's really lovely.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah. I don't know if we're running out of time. I just feel like your last discussion with Zehao is so interesting because the point you made, like the very interesting point about how like a butch lesbian cannot be goods, cannot be sell, is actually a point that I talked with my radical feminist friend, the radical in like even a little bit tough way radical, like as the house research found, like actually a lot of radical feminists in China now, it's a little bit anyway, not talking about these complicated phenomena, but just I think her point is interesting, saying that her understanding of that is just because like a very binary understanding of power structure, thinking that, you know, man, like masculinity cannot be good in that patriarchal capitalism. That's why butch lesbian cannot be sell, and that's why they want to be like short-haired butch style, because they believe that made them immune to some like sexual harassment and also the inefficiency that the house research really discovered. I feel that's a little bit problematic for that kind of binary key understanding of power, but yeah, but I want to hear your thoughts about that, because I feel like they are also in a very strong kind of logic of their own, and yeah.
Okay, I think I can't quite speak to that right now. I didn't completely, I don't know if I got all of that, but I mean, I'm not going to make a hard line here and say, you know, the butch is always and everywhere, some signal of recalcitrance and non-absorptive resistance. That's not possible. I'm just saying that the butch lesbian remains uninteresting to the society at large. I almost want to put it like that. Even in this, like, queer is interesting, non-binary is interesting. Everything can be cool, except this one kind of character. And there's a staying power to that interests me. That's there's a kind of anachronism, an endless, timeless anachronism to the butch. The butch is always out of time somehow. And I'm not saying that I mean, of course, there are all kinds of figures like Ellen DeGeneres or whoever who can cross over, but I think in terms of contrary gendering, not much stands outside of the mainstream. So why don't we just do one more question very quickly, Tori, maybe? I know you have a lot more down there, but I will have to leave in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, for sure. So
Thank you,
yeah, we can, I mean, we can either address one more question, or we can have give you some time to have like a final words for us if that's something you want to do.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I think all I want to say is, like, you know, I would love, in a way, I would have loved to hear more about your research, and maybe we'll find another time to do that, because I sense that the future of queer and trans theory is somehow here, you know, and this seems like a very, very high-powered group in many ways. And so I feel humbled, you know, by being here, and I'm really, you know, touched by your attention and honored that you invited me here to share this time with you. I appreciate it. I really, really do. It's been really lovely. And anyone should email me. I'd love to hear about the things that you're working on and hear more about the projects that you're engaged in, because that's how I learn. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Halberstam. Again, we really, really appreciate all your insights on the lecture and the Q&A session. We're sure that we've learned a lot tremendously from your sharing. So I guess this is almost the end of our 2 hours session. I will stay afterwards for a little while, but Professor Halberstam, you're free to leave. And yeah, this is, I guess, all for our session today.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
great
you.
year. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's my information. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.